right, today we will discuss the endocrine system, and this will be broken up into 2 videos. Now you see here that I have insulin vials shown on this homepage, and the reason that I have that listed, which we'll learn about a little more, but insulin is probably a hormone that you're familiar with. If you've ever known anyone who's diabetic, or if you yourself are diabetic, then you know that insulin is a very important part of managing that illness, and we'll talk more about how insulin is part of the endocrine system as we go through this lecture. Now, when we think about control over the body and the other body systems, we really think about the neuroendocrine system. In other words, the nervous system and the endocrine system working together as sort of the master control over all homeostasis, other body systems. Now, let's just analyze a little bit of difference between those two systems. So, we've learned a little bit about the nervous system, and we know that one thing we know is the nervous system is made up of cells, special cells called neurons, and those cells are sending signals that are electrical. So the type of signals that we see are electrical. Now, what that means is they are going to be sent and received very, very quickly. So when a signal is something that we need to have an effect very fast, then typically that's going to be sent by the nervous system. Now, the nervous system deals directly with chemical signals called neurotransmitters. So in addition to electrical signals, there are chemical signals that are released because there's a tiny gap between one cell to the next. But we'll leave the details of that for the nervous system. What I wanted to compare and contrast here is, first of all, the idea that this is electrical, that it is very, very fast, and it is sort of a direct signal, right, sent from one neuron to, let's say, a muscle cell that's signaling the contraction of that muscle cell. So it is a direct signal sent to that specific receptor or effector cell. Now, in the endocrine system, what we want to look at is the signals. Oh, there's a typo there. The signals are sent via chemicals. And they're not sent directly from one cell to the next. They're actually circulating in the entire blood system. So what's going to happen is there has to be something on a target cell that recognizes this particular chemical signal, and we call those receptors. So some cells will have receptors that will recognize these chemical signals, and therefore there will be some kind of effect, right? It will set off some kind of change. Some cells will not have receptors for those chemical signals, so they won't have any effect on those particular cells. Now, it's important for us to know that the endocrine system is made up of glands, and we'll talk through many of the glands of the endocrine system. And these glands are then going to produce and secrete or release these chemical signals that we call hormones. So what is a hormone? You've probably heard of that term, and you may think of, teenagers or something when you think about hormones, or you may think of the sex characteristics. But in fact, hormones are chemical signals, and these are just circulating throughout the blood. Now, I mentioned that the nervous system acts very quickly. Well, the endocrine system is going to be slower. Now, some hormones and some signals will have changes that occur within seconds, but some will take many hours. So let's spend some time talking specifically about what are glands and what are hormones next. All right, the body is made up of 2 types of glands. So our focus today, as we know, is going to be on the endocrine glands. But I just want to explain that an exocrine gland is something that secretes a product directly via a tube or a duct. Now, if you recall from our digestive system lecture, we talked about the pancreas is important in digestion. Food doesn't go through the pancreas, right? It's not part of the pathway of food. But the pancreas produces enzymes that help break down food. And there is a tube or a duct that carries those enzymes directly from the pancreas right to the small intestine. So the pancreas in that sense would be an exocrine gland. But the interesting thing about the pancreas is it also is an endocrine gland too, because it is going to secrete hormones. We mentioned insulin already, and another one called glucagon. Those are going to be secreted or released directly into the blood or the fluids of the body. So that's an interesting thing about the pancreas, is that it can serve as both. We're focused today on the endocrine glands of the body. Now, we already mentioned that a hormone is just a chemical signal, and these are produced by the endocrine glands of the body. Now, these are not sent directly anywhere. These chemical signals then are going to travel through the blood. So in other words, they are not directed to a specific organ or area of the body. The way that they cause their action is they have to be recognized or received by a receptor on the target cell. So this receptor must be specific to that particular hormone. And when it binds to the receptor, then the cell is going to have some kind of response. And we'll talk a little more about what that response might look like later. Now, this is a little bit of FYI, but there are 3 types of hormones out there that your body produces. The one you're probably maybe familiar with are steroid hormones like testosterone or estrogen. But there are others too that are called peptide, which means they're like a piece or a part of a protein, and amino acid derived. So these are hormones that originate sort of a amino acid that's been chemically changed. So the lipid soluble, that means fat soluble, okay? Peptide and amino acid derived, those are both water soluble. And why am I telling you this? Well, if you'll remember about a cell, if we think about a cell membrane, okay, the plasma membrane of a cell is made up of phospholipids, right? A bilayer of phospholipid. It has other stuff in there too, proteins and glycoproteins, cholesterol, but the majority of the plasma membrane is a phospholipid, which is a lipid. So what that means is lipid-soluble steroids are able to cross into the cell across that plasma membrane. So I'm just going to put here lipid-soluble can enter into the cell. Whereas the water-soluble hormones, water-soluble cannot, okay? They must be received on the outside of the cell. So a receptor, okay, for a water-soluble hormone must exist on the outside of the cell membrane. Whereas for lipid-soluble hormones, the receptor can be inside of the cell. Now let's just walk through some of the endocrine glands of the body. So first of all, the hypothalamus. This is the master control over the endocrine system. And it is both part of the nervous system and part of the endocrine system. And it is found in the brain. And as you see here, it's not specifically listed, but it would be here in this region above or superior to the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland acts along with the hypothalamus in controlling other glands or other endocrine glands of the body. And you can see that the pituitary gland is labeled there for us, also inside the brain. Now, the pineal gland is another gland that's located in the brain, and we see this here. So that's if the person is facing this direction, right? The pineal gland would be behind or posterior to the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Now, as we move on, sort of down from the brain downward, the thyroid gland is located in this region. The parathyroid gland, as you see labeled, the parathyroid glands are there labeled with the thyroid gland. The adrenal glands sit, there's a pair of them. They sit on top of each kidney. And then the pancreas, which we're all already a little bit familiar with because of our digestive system lecture. So we don't see the stomach and the intestines in this image, but we do see the pancreas right here. Lastly, we're talking about reproductive type glands, and that would be for females the ovaries and for males the testes. Now, we won't spend a lot of time talking about the ovaries and testes in this lecture because we have a separate one coming up on reproductive structures. So you'll find out more about those in a later lecture. Now, I want to spend just another few minutes, and I know there's a lot going on in this image, but I wanted to talk a little bit further about lipid-soluble versus water-soluble hormones. So we know that hormones are produced in glands, and then they're released into the bloodstream. So what you see here represented is a lipid-soluble hormone that is traveling through a capillary or through the blood system. And when it can diffuse across the capillary, it is able to cross the plasma membrane because it's lipid soluble, and once it binds to its receptor, it's actually able to enter into the nucleus of a cell. And when it does that, it changes what genes are being transcribed. So it will turn on, right, or cause a particular gene to be made into its protein or transcribed and translated into its protein product. So if you can't recall from Biology 1408 about transcription and translation, that's okay. What I want you to understand, though, and remember is that when a gene is turned on, what that means is its protein product is going to be produced. So in effect, these lipid-soluble hormones are causing particular proteins to be produced. Now, if we were talking about a water-soluble hormone, the water-soluble hormone would not be able to cross the plasma membrane. So there would need to be a receptor, right, on the outside of the plasma membrane that would bind to that particular hormone in order for that cell to react in some way to the hormone. Now, if a particular cell doesn't have a receptor for either the lipid-soluble or the water-soluble hormones, then that cell will not have any kind of reaction, right, or change based on the presence of that hormone in the blood. Now, we'll stop the lecture with this particular discussion of the hypothalamus because it is the master control of the endocrine system. And as I mentioned to you, it's part of both the nervous system and the endocrine system. Now, we're going to see that it has control over another gland called the Pituitary Gland. But for this particular moment in time, what I want you to see is the hypothalamus is actually producing two hormones that are important. One is antidiuretic hormone, or ADH for short, and oxytocin. Now, we'll talk a little bit later about the actions of these two hormones because the hypothalamus is not releasing these into the bloodstream directly. Instead, when it produces these two hormones, it releases them just to the posterior pituitary. So we're going to be looking at the pituitary gland into two different endocrine glands. So you see here we have the posterior pituitary shown in purple and the anterior pituitary shown in green. So the hypothalamus is going to produce ADH and oxytocin and release those down to the posterior pituitary. Now, the hypothalamus also has an effect on the anterior pituitary because it sends either a stimulating or an inhibiting hormone for several of the hormones that are made by the anterior pituitary. So in our next lecture, when we pick up with the pituitary glands, we'll talk about how they respond to the hypothalamus.